My name is David Livingstone, and I am an independent researcher. I've written several books now. Before, my most recent book is called Divide and Conquer, Muslims versus Islam. Before that, it was Zionism, History of a Jewish Heresy. And before that was my 6-volume oral Ab-Chaos, which means Order of Chaos, of course, which is a slogan of Scottish Rite Freemasonry. And it's an entire history of the occult, beginning in Babylon in the 6th century BC, through to the Crusades, the creation of the Templars, onto the Rosicrucians, the various aristocratic families that were involved in the preservation of the occult, closely aligned with the various prominent magicians and sorcerers like Paracelsus, Cornelius Agrippa, John Dee, through to the Renaissance, founding of Freemasonry, the Illuminati, and then carrying it forward to our time, especially following a number of important orders, like most importantly, the Order of the Golden Fleece, through to the occult revival of the 19th century, which blossomed into various trends like Theosophy, Synarchism, and the Golden Dawn, and then the parallel paths that evolved into Nazism and Zionism, and again Synarchism in the 20th century, leading all the way up to MKUltra, development of the personal computer, and then following the development of the far right in the United States, through organizations, most importantly, like the America First Committee, the American Security Council, who were with a group of rogue CIA agents called the Secret Team, headed by Chen Shackley, were involved in the JFK assassination, moved on into the Golden Triangle heroin trade, and ultimately evolved into Iran-Contra. And it's that stream, that right-wing stream in the United States, that first came to the surface with Ronald Reagan, but then most importantly, most recently, with Donald Trump. So I think that would be, to understand Peter Thiel, it would be the last 3 volumes of Ordo ab Chao, which would lay the groundwork to understand the how the American right had been organizing itself for almost 3/4 of a century. And then, but it would be mostly volume 6 that would focus more specifically, volume 6 called the Third Temple, which focused more specifically on the network of the Russian interference operation, which is dismissed, of course, by Trump, and questioned by many, but which in reality was an Israeli operation disguised as a Russian one, and including a whole network of basically back again with the arm of the American right, which evolved into the Council on National Policy, the CNP, of which Robert Mercer and Steve Bannon belonged to, who both founded Cambridge Analytica. And Cambridge Analytica was part of this Russian interference operation, teaming up with Peter Thiel's Palantir, all to help Trump get elected.
Now, look, you talking there about Ordo ab Chao, which is the title of this book you're citing there. I think it's important to untangle that Latin order from chaos. Obviously the end game is an order that is their idea of order. So the order seems to be we're now in charge. I mean, it's a little bit like Ian Fleming's Dr. No, where Sean Connery says to the criminal guy, he says, "World domination, same old dream." And of course, we know if we study mystics and the occult that they work in a sort of dualistic fashion, in that one side is putting out various myths about the future. We see the BBC talking about the great revolution in, mini nuclear energy, this sort of thing, which many would say, actually, look, if you have a look at it closely, these mini nuclear power plants haven't even been designed yet. So there's this sort of myth being put out there about how things are going to go, almost like a kind of put out as a prophecy, whilst at the same time, much more secretively behind the scenes, you've got the secret societies actually manipulating events through government, through the pharmaceutical industry, through the military, through industry, through banking, in order to make these things happen. So the idea is that the mystics are out there talking about all this stuff, whereas so secretly other people are actually making it. So the mystics have got this kind of wow, they've got it, they're in touch with higher forces. But actually, the interesting thing about Peter Thiel, and of course the chaos is necessary so that they can say, well, we need to reorganise everything in the way we want. The interesting thing about Peter Thiel is he's a bit of both, So he does do these quite high-profile interviews, like the one he did for the Hoover Institute last year about the Antichrist and the end of the world. And yet he's also a very powerful financier behind the scenes of some of these big social media companies and some of the people who really are shaping the world we're living in today. So can you just say a bit about Order Ab Chao and about Thiel and how he fits in?
Yeah, so because there's a couple of prongs there that are important, right? So like you mentioned, Order Ab Chao, which Ordo out of chaos, from Scottish Rite Freemasonry. But why I use that as the title of my book is because it refers to the core of the plot, which is we've talked about this many times, Tony, which is to fulfill the book of Revelation as they understand it. And so, to make a long story short, effectively, as the book of Revelation describes the chaos that precedes the arrival of the Messiah, based on their Kabbalistic interpretation, because they regard the book of Revelation as a Kabbalistic book. This is directly from the mouth of Albert Pike. And so they see, basically, from what I understand, is that since they want to accelerate the arrival of the Messiah, they have to create the chaos that is predicted to precede his arrival. So this is where, it gets into a moral territory, which is difficult for the average person to understand, because most people assume that everyone is driven by some kind of rational impulse. But when you get into Satanism, it's basically para-rational. It's no longer, it rejects morality as a whole. And so it even encourages going against what is normally considered moral. So the things that are reprehensible to 99% of the world, for them, are paths that are encouraged to follow and pursue. So it goes back a little bit further. So really where we need to understand is how Peter Thiel fits into the story of the far right. Basically, most of the right can trace itself to what's called the German Conservative Revolution. And there was a book written on the subject by a German historian whose name was Armin Muller. And he happened to be, I think he was a secretary to Ernst Jünger. He was also collaborated with Martin Heidegger. So he was himself really a core participant in the German Conservative Revolution. What's interesting about it is that it's a book that traces the rise of the right in Germany and treats Nazism really as not necessarily the core output of that trend, but really just one aspect of the larger trend. Another important person is a guy named, of course, well known, Arthur Muller-Vandenbroek, who coined the term Third Reich. And then you have other people like I already mentioned, Erzinger, who's a core character. But it begins in the late 1800s, I believe, or early 1900s, with things like the von der Vogel movement and various other sort of right-wing trends in the United States. So there's many personalities and many sub-trends. And again, Nazism was only a part of it. So probably I think the two most important people would have been Martin Heidegger was another classic example. But other than Ernst Jünger would be Carl Schmitt. And Carl Schmitt is an interesting person because he is considered the crown jurist of the Third Reich. So when the Nazis basically carried out a false flag operation of burning down the Reichstag and blaming it on the communists, Carl Schmitt articulated, he's a lawyer, so he articulated the legal case to argue that the Nazis needed to assume, or Hitler in particular, needed to assume dictatorial powers based on what he called a state of exception, or it's equivalent of a state of emergency. And which is basically, so it's a legal case that Hitler used to seize power. And what's curious is that Carl Schmitt ended up being very close pals with Leo Strauss. And if I remember correctly, it was largely from a recommendation from Leo Strauss that Leo Strauss got his job, I think with the assistance of the Rockefeller Foundation, came and joined the faculty of the University of Chicago, which is a Rockefeller institution. And so Carl Schmitt continued to exercise quite some influence beyond World War II. And of course, as did Leo Strauss, by becoming the godfather of the neoconservative movement. What's really curious as well, too, is if you go back to the philosophy of Leo Strauss, he was heavily dependent on the Kabbalah. And one of the aspect of his philosophy that he developed was a dichotomy between what he characterized as a land and sea dichotomy. So again, this was influenced by Alfred Mackinder. And Alfred Mackinder is the guy who's considered the godfather of geopolitics. He was, again, an important influence for Karl Haushofer, as well as Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the architect of the CIA ruse of fooling the Soviets into invading Afghanistan in 1979 by arming a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. And that was all part of what Brzezinski called the grand chessboard, which was that he believed that to control the world, you had to control the world island, and to control which was basically Eurasia, and to control the world island, you had to control Central Asia. So to come back to Carl Schmitt, he came up with, again, this dichotomy that there was a historical battle, which he based on Thomas Hobbes, of the Leviathan against the behemoth. So a sea monster against the monster of the land. And so this dichotomy was then adopted by Alexander Dugin. So Alexander Dugin, this is the basis of his entire world outlook, what he sees as a conflict between the sea power and the land power. And so the sea power, or the Atlantis, equivalent with Atlantis, is NATO and the West, so NATO, United States, and England, who are historically and faithfully opposed to the land power, which he equates with Hyperborea, and that he believes is led by Russia, who, and Dugin, of course, is again influenced by Mackinder. So Dugin is basically has adopted a geopolitical philosophy / strategy, which is a mirror image of the one pursued by neoconservatives, which was influenced by Leo Strauss and advanced by Samuel Mackinder, which again believes that we would be destined for a clash of civilizations, and primarily one of East against West. So Dugin clearly explains that the reason why the East is opposed to the West is not because they necessarily hate each other, but because they are just fulfilling their destiny. And he explained that so what Dugan is foreseeing is he's working towards so again leveraging Mackinder, this idea of the world island, particularly Eurasia, by creating a Eurasian empire which would unite the Eastern Orthodox peoples with the Islamic peoples of Central Asia to create a Eurasian empire that would oppose the Atlantic bloc and culminate in an empire of the end times. And he believes that basically Putin is a sort of messianic figure who he equates with the grand monarch prophesied by Nostradamus, who would help bring about the end times. In the end, because he explains that the end times is not just a prophecy, it's a task. So it is a scenario and script that they believe they need to follow, which explains the background of accelerationism that we can come back to.
At this point, we have to look at the Book of Revelation, say this is the plan they're working to. It's quite feasible that God has seen this plan, that it's not maybe that God has said this is what they're going to do. And surely the idea here is that they want to portray themselves as the good guys. What is in Revelation really is the Messiah appears, the second coming of Christ. But the thing is, and there's all talk peppered throughout the New Testament about the idea of false prophets and false messiahs. So, it's almost as if there's some sort of chess game going on here, with God on the one side, the occultists on the other, both trying to claim the Messiah for an event that they all know is going to happen.
Right. So the champions of the Antichrist are going to think that the Antichrist is the Messiah and that the real Messiah is the Antichrist. The Gnostics have for 2,000 years.
Why do you think people like Thiel? I mean, nobody really is talking about. The church is not talking about this, for example. Apart from some are, a few. Certainly the Church of England isn't. Yeah, so why is it that Thiel is bringing this up in public when nobody else really seems to dare?
I don't have anything directly on Peter Thiel as far as sort of theological outlook, except for the hints that he dropped in his in that interview that you talked about. So he calls himself a Christian, but I think it's pretty clear that he's a Gnostic. And so this is how we need to understand. So when Albert Pike refers to the Book of Revelation, what's interesting, we've talked about this before. So the Book of Revelation is the last book that was entered into the Bible. It wasn't entered into the New Testament until around the year 400 AD.
Yeah, that's right. Well, it was around, but it was contested, wasn't it?
It was contested. So even at that point, it was still resisted, even by somebody as prestigious as Eusebius, who was one of the most famous Christian fathers. So, and one of the main reasons why it was contested, because it was widely reputed to have been written by a Gnostic named Corinthus. And so what's interesting is that Albert Pike, in Morals and Dogma, which has long sort of served as a Bible of Freemasonry, he begins by explaining that the Book of Revelation is a Kabbalistic book, and he asserts that it was written by Corinthus. So, this is how we need to understand that the occult, I mean, even if you look at a book like Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, right? Dan Brown is trying to say that Gnosticism is true Christianity, and it's the Catholic Church who are the usurpers who tried to suppress it for 2,000 years, and that there's been all kinds of orders like the Templars and the Priory of Zion, the so-called Priory of Zion, and various, even Freemasonry, who are all descendants of the Gnostics who have been fighting the suppression of the Catholic Church and trying to advance the quote-unquote true Christianity. And if you want a hint of what Dan Brown understands to be what is true Christianity, he hints at it by the fact that the heroine of the book, the young girl who ends up helping the whatever the professor is that does the treasure hunt, that She was raised by her grandfather, who turns out to have been a grand master of the so-called Priory of Zion. And why she sort of suffered a kind of trauma for most of her life and distanced herself from her grandfather is because one time she happened to catch them in a moment of practicing a sex ritual. So Dan Brown is effectively trying to tell us that sex magic is a legitimate part of Christianity, and that is what Jesus supposedly, it's blasphemous, but saying that that's what Jesus actually truly taught, and this is the true message of Christianity that the church has been trying to suppress. So Gnosticism from the beginning taught the Bible inverse the roles in the Bible. So it taught that God had tried to impose his many rules on Adam and Eve. And so Satan snuck into the garden disguised as a serpent and helped Adam and Eve realize that God was an oppressor, and he was just trying to keep them from recognizing their true spiritual power. So effectively, Satan was a liberator. And so this is why the Gnostics believed that the laws, so they believed the story of the Bible, but they believed that Satan was the hero and God was the enemy. And so the rules outlined in the Bible were the rules of an oppressive God. So this is why if you look back at the early Gnostics and what they used to do, they used to practice orgies and adultery and incest. They used to even go so far because they believed that they had to overturn all the rules of the Bible in their worship of who they considered the true God, which was Satan. And Satan had basically taught them that do what thou wilt, that you should, that there are no rules. And so they deliberately contravened the rules of the Bible, including things like consuming urine and feces and semen and menstrual blood, murder, anything that would be considered quote unquote moral according to the Bible tradition, they deliberately overturned.
Yeah, but they're defining themselves by the thing that they're trying to be against. They're really nothing, aren't they?
Yes. Well, I mean, it's Satanism. So yes, this Satanism is a propensity in the human being, right? This is what this entire history that we're looking at is a cosmic conspiracy. It's a conspiracy. It hasn't started with Peter Thiel. It didn't start in the 20th century. It didn't start with the Freemasons, the Illuminati. It started with Satan's rebellion against God. It's a choice. It's a choice of, do you believe in true good, right? That compassion and love, and that people should be basically caring for each other, that people can live together regardless of their about their background, of their race, of their religion. It's a hope, right? Belief in God is a belief in the hope, and a hope of a beauty. And Satanism is a rejection of all that. It's Satanism is the belief that there is no hope, that it's no use, that some people are better than others. So those who recognize that quote unquote fact don't need to waste their time trying to be compassionate towards the weaker. They should be ruling over the weaker ones. They should be enslaving the weaker ones. The weaker ones should be obeying them at whatever will. The weaker ones are expendable.
It sounds a bit like eugenics. This idea that this is a particular breed of person who's somehow better. The Übermensch and the Untermensch. Is that right?
Well, yes, of course. It's not a coincidence. It is a direct output of Satanism, eugenics, racism, elitism. All these aspects are neoliberalism. All these are products of neoliberalism, or even techno-libertarianism, the kind of philosophy that Thiel advances. It's all based on the same sort of idea that some are genetically superior to others.
So, when Thiel talks about being a Christian and he quotes the book of Matthew, actually it's, I think it's the Olivet Discourse he talks about in the book of Matthew. When you say he's a Gnostic, what do you mean?
I mean that he reads the Bible again, like we talked about this before. If you look in the Lost Symbol, written by Dan Brown, he does this long search where he tries to find the lost symbol of Freemasonry. In the end, he discovers it. He discovers that the lost symbol of Freemasonry is the Bible. But then he quotes William Blake, another famous Satanist, who said that where you read black, I read white. Right? So yes, he might be reading the Bible, but he's reading the Bible where he sees Satan as the liberator and God as the oppressor.
Well, he's not explaining that in the interview with the Hoover Institution. No. Anyway, look, let's try and bring this also a bit down to earth with what's happening in the Middle East, because I see lots of people talking about various spiritual things, but I think at the end of the day, we've got to have compassion for those who are being starved to death, shot as they're trying to get food. And it really does seem, when you mentioning Gnosticism, that rings bells with me, because it seems like somebody has got it in for that holy bit of real estate, and they're trying to create hell there.
Yes. Yes, they are. And with Peter Thiel's help.
This is the wild thing about him, is that he is helping create this world. He's funding the Daddy's Home software, which enables no human decisions to even be involved, as families are killed automatically using his drones. So I think that kind of backs up what you're saying about him being a sort of upside down and using. I mean, is it simply, do you think that he's trying to get ahead of the game? He knows that people are going to be criticising him for the evil stuff that's going on, and so he's trying to almost like put himself forward as a kind of religious figure, pope figure or something.
Yeah, absolutely. He's a very slippery guy. Yeah, I think he's a nerd. He's a nerd that clearly has all kinds of poor social skills. Very awkward guy, right? He maybe had some sort of intellectual skills that allowed him to get where he was. He had, of course, he benefited from all kinds of privileges as well too, so that's questionable. But I think what happens to a lot of these guys is that, and I think this is what happens to a lot of scientific racism in the 20th century, is they equate a higher IQ with genetic superiority, right? So he basically, and I think it's how he compensates for his low self-esteem, is by trying to build himself up as being some kind of superior character, and he measures his superiority by his wealth and his intelligence. And of course, this is a crime that's committed by a lot of these idiots. So this is how, and unfortunately, he takes it to the very extreme, where he is going to go so far as to regard large segments of humanity as ultimately being expendable on the pathway to the plot that he believes he is responsible for helping us along with.
Yeah, so look, how do people, I'm not just talking about Thiel himself, but how do people like him justify this? Are they looking for, say, they do create their Third World War, maybe it's even a nuclear war. They aren't just doing this because they're naughty schoolboys. There must be some sort of more long-term plan, looking beyond that into the future. What do them and people like them expect to gain from this?
Well, see, this is where it's very difficult, because, we if we want to look for a rational answer, there isn't one. They don't think rationally. They don't think in the same moral terms as you and I do. So you assume that there would have to be something would have to make sense. Right? And it doesn't.
Well, I think to a certain extent, I think it does. I mean, the Islam and Judaism, the Abrahamic faiths, in such a conflict in the Middle East, are going to come out of it with, if we get out the other side of all of this, with a very bad reputation. I mean, I know the similar sort of thing happened in Northern Ireland, that even though actually it was the Good Friday Agreement, which was a coming together of Protestant and Catholic sides, that actually the real argument in Northern Ireland wasn't really a religious one. It was a cultural one between the settlers from the unionist side, who were basically pro-English, and the Republican or nationalist side, who were always marginalised. The Catholics had always been marginalised over there, so it wasn't actually a religious thing. It was more of a culture. So what I'm wondering is if they're looking at saying, well, look, this is our little game here we're going to play. Maybe billions will die. We don't really care. But we're going to come out on top, and the Abrahamic faiths are going to get their noses rubbed in the mud.
So you've read the book of Revelation. You know how it ends, right? So it's hard to explain. If you were to read a story and read that why would you choose to align yourself with the evil villain in the story that ultimately is going to lose, right? It doesn't make it. I don't know how to explain it.
Well, look, I would say, David, most probably they look at things like Revelation. I mean, they believe that their ancestors have written it, that it's a load of rubbish, it's just a bit of fun. But they may also look at it as something which is that this is almost the central book of getting rid of all the bad people in the world and heaven descending on planet Earth from above, and it being the end of their reign. So obviously, that's something that they'd rather like to.
I don't think it's that rational. No, I don't think it's that rational. I think it's a. So one of the most famous members of the Illuminati was Goethe, right? He's basically the German equivalent of Shakespeare. And what's his most famous work? Faust. It's a story about a scientist, researcher, scholar, intellectual who sells his soul to the devil for knowledge, right? And somehow there's an excuse where he's able to get out of it and God forgives him, because of his sincere quest or something along those lines. So why is a story about a scholar selling his soul to the devil, so important to so many of these people? This is how they see it. What about Satan himself? Satan knows that he's doomed. Why doesn't he? Why is he committed to his plot anyway? He knows that the here and now is his only opportunity, but that's what he's choosing. Right? So we have to understand that Satanists, they all make the same conscious decision. They're making a conscious decision to choose this life at the sake of the next. Right? That's why what's interesting. I mentioned William Blake. William Blake was part of a whole circle of intellectuals in the mid 1800s that are referred to as romantic Satanists, and that included people like William Godwin, who was the first sort of godfather of anarchism, and his wife Mary Wollstonecraft, who was considered the first feminist. They were the parents of Mary Shelley. Mary Shelley married Percy Bysshe Shelley, who was a Rosicrucian. Both of them were close friends with Lord Byron, another degenerate, who was also a member of the Carbonari. They held a contest where in one night Mary Shelley wrote the novel Frankenstein. The novel Frankenstein is about a Faustian sorcerer who attempts to create life by electrocuting a number of body parts of a cadaver that were sewn together to try to bring it to life. And so if you look at the history of transhumanism written by Nick Bostrom, and transhumanism, of course, being what Peter Thiel openly advances, Bostrom traces the history of transhumanism all the way back to the Gnostics and the alchemists, and he cites the Shelley's Frankenstein as being a very important milestone in the history of transhumanism. So this is what I'm saying is that these are people who have reading the same book of Revelation as you do, and they believe in the same outcome, the same plot as you do, but somehow, nevertheless, they have chosen to side with the loser. They have chosen to side with Satan. And again, this is why I was bringing up the romantic Satanists, because what makes the Romantic Satanists, what they all have in common is a reverence for John Milton. John Milton himself is interesting because he was part of this entire circle of Rosicrucians known as the Hartlib Circle. And so John Milton's Paradise Lost, it's in that book that he made the famous line, better, you probably better know better than I do, better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven, right? So it's a strange kind of ideological. This is why, like, why did when Jesus asked for permission of God to try to talk Satan out of it, because it just seems so irrational. He just thought there's got to be a way I can get him to see how ridiculous and how what a dead end that he's gotten himself into. But Satan was stubborn. It's a kind of arrogance and stubborn arrogance, which is irrational and inexplicable because it's a fixation. It doesn't make sense. And that's what I think all these guys, that they've made this commitment to, they side with the devil, and they're going to take now. They're going to take today and, this life, and they want to make this life everything possible. This is why it's like wealth, power, everything, they're huge yachts. They want to maximize this life because that's what they've chosen. And they've chosen this as their heaven and forsook the next life.
And they reward other people who think like they do as well. But look, you mentioned earlier the sort of similar roots of Zionism and Nazism. We're now looking at this horror story unfolding in Gaza and in the West Bank particularly. Can you just go back to that thought? Because I think it's quite interesting. People completely, this is almost like the one thing you're never allowed to say is to compare the activities of Netanyahu with Adolf Hitler. Yeah.
So, well, this is where it gets a little tricky, right? So Nazism came out of the trend of German nationalism, which started with Weimar Classicism in the late 1800s. And so the Romantic era that emerged out of Weimar Classicism, which then produced German nationalism, which then outproduced entire movement of which Nazism was only the later output or later development. So there's two people in particular who contributed to the rise of German nationalism, and that was Fichte and Gottfried Herder. And Gottfried Herder is the one who devised the idea of the folk. And that idea was also a Kabbalistic idea, because all these guys in Weimar Classicism in particular, of which Goethe was a very important example, was a movement dominated by members of the Illuminati. So Herder was a member of Illuminati. Fichte wasn't necessarily, but his entire network was. Then you have other people like Lessing, and all of them were very close friends with Moses Mendelssohn. And Moses Mendelssohn, so we mentioned this before, but Rabbi Entelman wrote a 2-volume book about the Sabbatian movement called To Eliminate the Opiate. And he discovered a list in a library in New York that had been kept by Friedrich Nicolai. Friedrich Nicolai is famous in the history of the Illuminati because he was the main publisher of the order. He was also friends with Lessing and a very close friend with Moses Mendelssohn. And Moses Mendelssohn, so according to the list that Rabbi Entelman discovered, Moses Mendelssohn was listed as a direct successor of Shabtai Zvi. And so we've talked about this as well many times. Shabtai Zvi declared himself Messiah in 1666. And he declared that he basically rejected the Bible and the Talmud and favored the Zohar and taught a doctrine of what's been referred to as a holiness of sin. So once with the arrival of the Messiah, this is what he explained, the rules of the Bible were only applicable for the time prior to the advent of the Messiah. With the arrival of the Messiah, they were no longer applicable. So this is why you find, so effectively, the Sabbatians were a Gnostic sect, a Jewish Gnostic sect in this case. And that's why they practice all the same practices which had been historically attributable to the Gnostics, which are things like their famous ritual was what they call the extinguishing of the lights. So they would get all their families together, and then they would turn out the lights, and that's when the orgies would begin, and the wife swapping, and various things of that nature. To jump ahead, this is why Freud was a very important exponent of Sabbatian morality. So Moses Mendelssohn, again, was now a successor of Shabbatai Zvi. Another person important in this time was Jacob Frank. But effectively, Moses Mendelssohn is considered the father of modern Judaism. So he's the one who articulated the need for Jews to assimilate. So under his guidance, they began to leave the ghettos and they began to assimilate themselves into European culture, where they started to become doctors and lawyers and professors, and basically, get rid of their Jewish traditions and adopt European guys. So his followers became now very influential in a Masonic order called a Masonic lodge, a Jewish Masonic lodge called the Juden Lodge, Frankfurt Juden Lodge. That's the way it's referred to. It's got a longer name. It's called the Lodge of the Rising Dawn, or something like that. And most of them were also members of the Asiatic Brethren, which was another pseudo-Masonic cult founded by the nephew of Jacob Frank, so another Sabbatian order. And so this is what I trace in my Zionism book, is now you have these twin paths. So now all the friends of Moses Mendelssohn, who were part of the network of Weimar classicism and the early German Romantic movement, particularly, so Moses Mendelssohn's daughter, Dorothea, married Friedrich Schlegel, and Friedrich Schlegel is the guy who coined the term Aryan. And what I propose in my book is that the whole concept of the Aryan race is actually, paradoxically, a Kabbalistic concept, which I don't want to get too off topic, but basically that sort of celebrates what's called the mixed multitude. It's a concept from the Bible of a people who traditionally oppose the Jewish people. And so they regard the Aryans as being descendants of the mixed multitude who survived the cataclysm of Atlantis and then landed in the mountains of Asia, where they spread out. And so these are Jewish heretics who simultaneously regard themselves as being Aryans. Because what's interesting now, again, with Moses Mendelssohn's influence through Weimar classicism and people like Fichte and Herder, you get the twin paths. So out of the Weimar classicism, you get the birth of the German nationalist movement. And then through his followers, through the Frankfurt Juden Lodge, you get the occult revival. Most importantly, somebody like Edward Bulwer-Lytton. And Edward Bulwer-Lytton becomes sort of the chief influence of the occult revival. And through his influence, you get movements like Elena Blavatsky and her Theosophical movement, Saint Yves Delvege, who the founder of the Synarchist movement, and most importantly, the Golden Dawn. And the Golden Dawn was deliberately named in reference to the Frankfurt Juden Lodge, which itself was called the Order of the, I can't remember the name exactly, I think it was the Order of the Rising Dawn or Nascent Dawn or something like that. So, of course, the primary influences, the ideological, theosophical influences of the Nazi movement came from Edward Bulwer-Lytton's Zanoni, or his book, The Coming Race, which was about people who lived in some kind of underworld civilization that harnessed the power of the Vril. And so, along with Theosophy and Synarchism, they influenced two people in particular, which was Guido von List and Lance von Liebenfels, and I believe a member of the List Society or affiliated with the List Society was Franz Hartmann, who was both a member of, a friend of Blavatsky and a member of the OTO. So Aleister Crowley's OTO. So these occult influences basically now became the core of the ideology. Liebenfels and List developed what's referred to as Ariosophy, which was the Aryan doctrine of the Nazis, which then combined with the German nationalism that could be traced back to people like Herder and Fichte. But all along the way through the 18th century, I trace in my book all the various connections between the Frankists and the burgeoning German nationalist movement. And probably the most important person would be Richard Wagner. Because Richard Wagner, he's known for his anti-Semitism, but the reality is that his father was Jewish. His real father was Jewish. He was born in the Jewish neighborhood of Leipzig, and I trace in my book his entire network was peopled with members of the Frankist sect, and most importantly of the Frankfurt Juden Lodge. Another is and Wagner's protege, of course, was Friedrich Nietzsche. So here to see this confluence. So basically, from the same sources, you get this two parallel developments of, again, German nationalism and sorry, I missed one, of German nationalism, of sort of like the occultism of the Golden Dawn, but also of the Zionist movement, because it's effectively Moses Mendelssohn's influence that out of the type of Reformed Judaism that he inspired, that the Zionist movement was possible. And so Theodor Herzl, when he was at the University of Vienna, he joined a fraternity called the Albia fraternity. The whole fraternity movement was, again, the birthplace of the German nationalist movement that could trace itself back to Fichte and Herder. And the most important exponent was a guy named George Schroeder, who had Rothschild family connections and so on and so forth. And what brought them all together was a reverence for Wagner. So I believe it was in the second Zionist Congress. Herzl opened it with the theme from Wagner's famous opera called the Tannhäuser. And I'm just going to mention this quickly. We don't have to get into the details, but the Tannhäuser opera is an opera. It's about what's called a Sängerkrieg, or a singing contest between a group of Minnesingers that took place in the in the 1100s, maybe 1200s, and included Wolfram von Eschenbach, who was the author of the Grail story about the Night Swan. And so this is why the Night Swan, the family, the descendants of the Night Swan, basically because the Night Swan was apparently the father of Godefroy of Bouillon, who was the leader of the First Crusade, and then all these various sort of aristocratic families, European aristocratic, the important ones that played a role in the survival of the cult, all could trace their descent back to the Night Swan, and they openly acknowledged their descent from him. And this is why you find that it's their descendants who produced the Rosicrucian movement. Where was I going with that? So another very important descendant of who acknowledged his descent from the Night Swan was this entire Rosicrucian network were also the backers of Luther. And Luther spent some important time at the Marburg Castle, which is where the so-called singing contest took place, where Wolfram wrote his Grail story. And Marburg was in the Eisenach in Germany, which was ruled by people, an aristocratic family who claimed descent from the Night Swan. They were the rulers of Saxe-Weimar-Eisenach. And it was Karl August of Saxe-Weimar-Eisenach, who was a member of the Illuminati, who sponsored the Weimar classicism movement. And according to Wagner's son-in-law, Wagner's mother was actually the illegitimate daughter of his brother, which would explain why Wagner placed so much importance on the myth of the Night Swan. But somehow, I'm not sure exactly where they saw the significance, but again, the significance goes back to the Crusades, and which I believe was a proto-Zionist movement, because one of the things that Godefroy Bouillon did before he embarked on his crusade is we had to go visit Rashi, who was the most famous, who was considered actually probably the godfather of the modern Zionist movement, the most famous Jewish scholar of Middle Ages. He was also a teacher to Stephen Harding, who was a friend of Bernard of Clairvaux, who was the patron of the Templars, and he was also close with Hugh of Champagne, who was one of the 9 founders of the Templar Order. So now skipping ahead, Herzl also placed importance on Wagner and the story of the Night Swan, and he was a member of the Albia fraternity, which was the hub of the burgeoning German nationalist movement, which included the most important personality. The central personality of the movement was George von Schonerer, who inspired Hitler.
I think it'd be nice if we could finish with something which is very, very up to date. Last week on Radio 4, we had 2 programs here on National Radio where I heard the voice of my old school friend, Nick Land, chit-chatting away about anarcho-capitalism and how that's really where everything was going and there's nothing we can do to stop it. So can you just explain how some of this is unfolding today? Because quite a lot of people are now starting to take quite an interest in Nick and this dark enlightenment, including obviously people like Thiel, Musk, the rest of them who've known about it for quite a long time. So what are they up to?
So where it gets interesting is that this is where I came back. So we talked about the German Conservative Revolution, right? With Carl Schmitt being one of the principal personalities who was a friend with Leo Strauss behind the New Conservative movement and so on and so forth. So the Armin Muller, who was the guy who wrote the book on the German Conservative Revolution, who was a secretary to Ernst Jünger, became friends with Alain de Benoit. And Alain de Benoit is the founder of what's called the French New Right, La French Nouvelle Droite, and an order called Grèce. And that's an interesting group because it included all kinds of very influential people like Conrad Lawrence, Arthur Kessler, who had formerly worked at CIA. He's the one who was responsible for popularizing the idea of the Jews being actually Khazars in his book, The 13th Tribe. There's an MKL doctor, I can't remember his first name, Eiseneck, I think is what it was. And so Alain de Benoit became the mentor to Alexander Dugin. And this is how Dugin basically was introduced to the tradition of the German Conservative Revolution and to Carl Schmitt, through whom he adopted the dichotomy of the land and sea. And so Dugin now seems to be, in my estimation, I think he's the sort of the godfather of the Luciferian International. He's friends with basically every possible connector to the Luciferian and occult network worldwide. He was a friend with what's his name? One of the founders of the Solar Temple. Another one is not Claudio. Is it Claudio Muti? Claudio Muti was a member of the Murabitun. He's and Murabitun was founded by a guy named, his real name is Ian Dallas. He calls himself Abdul Qadir al-Murabit, who was a friend of Ernst Jünger and Alfred Hoffman, who, of course, is known for having discovered LSD and working with the CIA. So the Solar Temple itself was a development of a group called the Lucifer Gesellschaft, or the Lucifer Society. And I can't remember the details, but somehow I think it was involved. It claimed to be descended from the Thule Society, which founded the Nazi Party, and the Polaire Brotherhood. The Polaire Brotherhood is a little less well known. This is a very important synarchist movement that emerged, I believe, in the 1920s. And connected most of the leading occult personalities of the time. And so the whole Polaire philosophy is central to Dugin's own political philosophy. So Dugin is also buddies with a guy named Kerry Bolton, and Kerry Bolton is a representative of the Order of Nine Angles. An Order of Nine Angles is a Nazi this is one of the few groups that openly advocates blood sacrifices. It's also, so it's a Nazi and neo-Nazi and satanic group, and they advance a cause, sort of a philosophy called accelerationism. And acceleration itself is interesting because it's traced back to the Process Church. The Process Church, the Final Judgment, which is the group that influenced Charles Manson. So Charles Manson, again, was also advancing an accelerationist philosophy. It's the philosophy that, so again, the Process Church believes in the Book of Revelation and the coming of the end times, and they want to accelerate it. So this is why Manson was hoping to, that the murders that he inspired would bring about a race war, which would help accelerate the coming of the end times. And of course, as is famous, his followers killed pregnant Sharon Tate, who was the wife of Roman Polanski, who was the director of Rosemary's Baby, a movie about a woman who is deceived into participating in a satanic ritual where she is impregnated by Satan himself and then gives birth to the son of Satan. And a movie that was advised by Anton LaVey, founder of the Church of Satan. The movie was produced by Robert Evans, and Robert Evans was one of the most famous producers in Hollywood. He was also a friend of Henry Kissinger. He was a friend of Roy Radin. And in the book, The Ultimate Evil by Maury Terry, he discovers that Roy Radin is the head, it was the satanic leader of the Process Church. So linking Roy Radin to Robert Evans. And so the same movement was behind this. Basically, the case of Maury Terry's book is that the Process Church was behind the Manson killings, that David Berkowitz was a member of was a part of this Process Church network. What's interesting is that I believe, yes, in Maury Terry quotes David Berkowitz, aka the Son of Sam, as claiming that he had participated in parties hosted by Roy Cohn, which involved sort of various sort of satanic sex activities. And Roy Cohn, of course, was the chief mentor of Donald Trump. Coming back to Peter Thiel, so Dugan's friend Terry Thornley is involved with the Order of the Nine Angles, a group which has been defended by your friend Nick Land. And so Nick Land now is considered the current godfather of the acceleration in this movement. And it's a movement that extends not only to the Dark Enlightenment advanced by Peter Thiel, but also an entire network of international neo-Nazi terrorists that includes basically, they're part of a forum, I believe it's called Iron March, and include groups like Atomwaffen and the Azov battalion that was involved in Ukraine, who all also trace their inspiration to Alexander Dugin. And I'd like to talk about another interesting connection of Peter Thiel. So in 2007, I think is what it was, there's an Israeli newspaper that published the handwritten notes of Netanyahu that listed his favorite billionaires that he reached out to for financial support for his campaigns and other activities. So on the list, of course, were people like Rupert Murdoch, Donald Trump. So this is long before Donald Trump was running for president. David Geffen, who was a fascinating person because he was closely connected with the entire Laurel Canyon scene. And a man named Vincent Cengiz, who is, I believe he's like some kind of British tycoon, but he's originally Jewish and born in Iraq, I think is what it was. So Vincent Cengiz was the chief shareholder of a company called the SEL Group, and the SEL Group is the parent company of Cambridge Analytica, which again was founded by Steve Bannon and Robert Mercer, both members of the CNP. So in 2015, the SEL Group they used to edit a publication called Defense Strategic Communication, which is an official journal of Stratcom, which is a NATO organization. And there was an article written by a guy named Jeff Garcia, if I'm pronouncing his name properly, who is a former employee of Peter Thiel. And he advanced the whole idea of using what he called meme warfare. And he, in particular, proposed using the tactics of a guy named Chuck Johnson, who was an infamous, probably the most infamous troll that was deeply involved in all kinds of antics leading up to Donald Trump's first election. He was also teaming up with people like Richard B. Spencer, who was the head of the alt-right movement, with Mike Cernovich. Mike Cernovich was basically pretty much the chief promoter of the Pizzagate hoax. I don't know if you know about that. And so he's referring, so basically this is the whole background of the tactics, the meme warfare that was used to help Trump get elected. And the key tools for doing that was Cambridge Analytica, again, a company founded by SEL Group, owned by Netanyahu's billionaire. And the company that assisted Cambridge Analytica in breaching the Facebook data that they used to micro-target the various parts of the American population was Peter Thiel's Palantir.
Well, it's a small world. So just back to Nick. I'm not obsessed by Nick, but it's obviously interesting to see so many people kind of eating out of his hand. He's now sitting over there in Shanghai, obviously contributing in some way. He feels he's sitting on top of the cake in a way, that the Chinese economy, the Chinese political system has really become the great industrial heartland of the world. It's becoming incredibly productive. It's loads of stuff getting done. And it's also, David, as the West is dying, so China is rising. It's like Aleister Crowley's Golden Dawn is coming true. China, you can't ignore it. It's a very, very powerful. I mean, their actual armed forces do virtually nothing, but they could. They could do a hell of a lot if they felt like it. The fact of the matter is, though, that they're at the industrial heartland of planet Earth right now, and it seems to me that this is possibly a model. You know, whatever cataclysm there's going to be, maybe China is the model that everyone else is supposed to follow. There's a lot of the surveillance type technology, the social credit type stuff, that could easily be implemented in other parts of the world as well. It looks like there are some people here in the West that would love to have that.
Yeah. I'm not sure. I'm wondering how that's all plays out, but it just makes me think that people like Dugan has been advancing the idea that was originally advanced by Henry Kissinger, which is the idea of a multipolar world order. So they make it seem like these, because China was founded on the philosophy of Rothschild agent Karl Marx, right? So I'm not so sure that they are the opponent of the West that they're made out to be. I think they're part of the game, as of course Russia is. And again, so the idea is that it also goes, this whole idea of, this is why they're using this conspiratorial idea of globalists, right? That the globalists are trying to create a global order, and they're mobilizing anti-globalism for the cause of globalism, deceptively. They make it seem like a lot of people would be happy that America would finally be losing power, so that we'll be emerging out of a unipolar order. But the ruse is that the whole point of a new world order is not for a single power to dominate the world, but for the world to become a federation of states. So the New World Order is basically going to be, like it will be some kind of equilibrium, sort of like a global pact.
I mean, you could also see it that some individuals want to dominate through constantly keeping in George Orwell's 1984 style constant war, so that everybody's tied up with that whilst they're pulling the strings. But can we just go back to Nick? What do you make of him now? He's become somebody that's now he's a little bit like Peter Thiel, it seems to me, that he's someone who's very much involved in all of this actual dark stuff behind the scenes, but also in a public way, so both of them are. But what they seem to be both trying to do is to get ahead of the discussion about how bad they are. But it's interesting that they're both coming out. So the dark Enlightenment, how does that relate to this whole business of transhumanism? Because I think people are slowly getting to grips with all this stuff. It'd be just great, finally, David, to get your take on where this is all heading. The technology is quite clearly starting to take over. You've mentioned before this, I think, which are 100% spot on, with this idea of AI being the golem. They're trying to create life. Of course, they aren't creating life. They're creating artificial life, fake life, which is not going to do what life does. So what do you make of Nick's role in this and his vision in this sort of transhumanist world they're trying to create?
Well, I mean, this is why, it sounds like I'm mentioning a lot of threads, but they're all one, right? It's all one single Luciferian tradition. It's it starts at least with Shabtai Zvi. It evolves to the Weimar classicism. Out of Weimar classicism, then you get Romantic Satanism, then you get the occult revival, and out of the occult revival, you get the Nazi movement. Nazi movement was part of the German conservative revolution, which continued to be advanced, which by all the various proponents like Heidegger, Ernst Jünger, like I said, Carl Schmitt, which is then inherited by the principal advocates of the German conservative revolution today would be people like Dugin and Peter Thiel. So it looks like it is a mixed bag of things from the outside, and it looks like they're involved in different tangents of it, but it's really just one single Luciferian philosophy. So that's where you can place the Dark Enlightenment and Nick Land. So I think what you're looking at is you're looking at a dark Luciferian theology, which they adhere to behind the scenes, which we don't hear about, and the public face that we get is things like techno-libertarianism and transhumanism and Dark Enlightenment, and then their alignment with Israel, which is consistent as well. But some of it we have to piece together, but how do you explain this alignment with Zionism? And that's the thing, is that this alignment with Zionism, how do you explain the alignment of people like Thiel simultaneously with a neo-Nazi accelerationist trend and support for Israel? Because they've always been twin children of the same tradition. So, as far as what we're doing, we always have to go back to the core, and ultimately it goes back to the fulfilling the book of Revelation, fulfilling Bible prophecy. This is the core. They see it as the core of history, and they want to be at the heart of development of history. They want to hijack history.
Well, I mean, there's a certain inevitability to human beings becoming so devious that they try to control the whole of creation, and then they come a cropper. But anyway, so finally, David, I said finally before, but finally, do you think they're going to? I mean, clearly they're trying to create systems where they can control the entire planet, that they can hypnotize people, basically, control what people think, take people out of the way if they start to, cause trouble. That's what they're up to. But can they succeed? Is there something you think in human nature and in God maybe that is going to stop them?
Well, that sure would be nice to know, but I think that's part of the plan is for us not to know. So that because God is waiting for us to put our trust in Him. We want some kind of guarantee that, yes, you guys are on the winning side, it's all good. That's not how it works, right? God wants us to see, are you going to have faith? Are you going to have trust in Him? Are you going to throw yourself into the fray, regardless of what it means to you?
If you look at this system of global slavery that they're trying to bring in, I think you'll probably find even people who are involved in witch covens will be rebelling against it. So in a way, it's bringing all the different spiritual and no spiritual angles together against them.
It's cosmic. It's on a cosmic scale, right? So we don't know. We don't know. We'll have to wait and see.
We will, and also, of course, that means that the outcome will be cosmic.
Absolutely. And so God wins in the end. We know that, right? And that's the point. They know it as well, too.
David, can you just remind listeners of your latest couple of books and whereabouts they can get hold of your work?
You bet. So, yes, my website is ordoabko.ca. And that's where I've got actually now, 3 books that are fully online. So that's my entire 6-volume series of Ordo ab Chao, as well as my Zionism book and my most recent Divide and Conquer. There's also